There's a gap in human history that nobody talks about. A period so vast, so incomprehensibly important, that everything you think you know about being human happened during it. 100,000 years. That's the space between when our ancestors became anatomically modern humans and when they finally started building cities and writing things down. 100,000 years of human history that might as well be invisible. Think about that for a second. We can tell you what happened last Tuesday. We have records going back thousands of years. We know when Rome fell, when the pyramids were built, when humans learned to farm. We can trace the lineage of kings and the rise and fall of empires. We can tell you what people ate in ancient Mesopotamia, what they wore in dynastic Egypt, what they believed in classical Greece. But between the moment our species emerged as Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago and the moment we started planting crops about 12,000 years ago, there's this enormous stretch of time where humans were doing something. Living, surviving, thinking, creating, and we barely know what. The numbers are staggering when you really sit with them. Recorded history, everything from the invention of writing to now, spans about 5,000 years. 5,000 years of kings and wars and inventions and philosophical movements and everything we think of as human civilization. But that's 1/20th of the period we're talking about. 1/20th. For every year of recorded history, there are 20 years of human existence before it. 20 years of people living full lives, loving their children, forming communities, creating meaning, leaving almost no trace. And it's not like these were primitive proto-humans fumbling toward true humanity. These were people with brains exactly like yours, literally identical. If you could somehow transport a baby from 80,000 years ago to the present and raise them in a modern family, they'd be indistinguishable from any other child. They'd learn to read and write. They'd master technology. They'd go to college, pursue careers, fall in love. The hardware was the same. The capacity was there. What differed was circumstance, environment, the accumulated knowledge available to them. Your ancestors from this period weren't less intelligent than you. In many ways, they were more capable. They could track animals across landscapes by reading signs you wouldn't even notice. They could identify hundreds of plant species and know which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They could read weather patterns, predict seasonal changes, navigate without maps or compasses across territories spanning hundreds of miles. They could make fire from scratch, construct shelters from natural materials, create tools that required understanding of physics and material science that we're only now beginning to appreciate. They survived in conditions that would kill most modern humans within days. Yet despite all this capability, despite their identical brains and remarkable skills, they left behind almost nothing we can study. No written records, obviously, because writing wouldn't be invented for another 90,000 years. But also precious few artifacts, fragmentary archaeological sites, massive gaps in the fossil record where entire millennia passed and left barely a trace. It's as if someone took humanity's autobiography and tore out 99% of the pages, leaving us with a few random paragraphs scattered across 100,000 years, and saying figure out the story from this. Sure, we have some fossils, we have stone tools scattered across continents, we have a handful of cave paintings that take your breath away. But here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. For massive chunks of this 100,000-year period, we have almost nothing. The fossil record goes quiet. The archaeological sites disappear. It's like someone took humanity's photo album and ripped out 99% of the pages. The few snapshots we do have are bizarre and beautiful and frustratingly incomplete. We find evidence that humans were wearing shell necklaces 70,000 years ago in South Africa, making art in Indonesian caves 45,000 years ago, sailing to Australia 65,000 years ago across open ocean, building structures from mammoth bones 18,000 years ago in Ukraine. Each discovery is remarkable. Each one hints at cognitive abilities, social complexity, technological sophistication that we're only beginning to understand. But between these scattered moments, there are gaps, enormous gaps where entire millennia passed and left barely a trace. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments. Tokyo at 2 in the morning, Berlin at midnight. Someone in Alaska at 3 in the afternoon. all of us wondering about the same lost world. Here's what makes this time period so frustrating. It's not ancient history in the way the extinction of the dinosaurs is ancient history. This is recent. This is us. Every major development that makes you human, language, symbolic thought, art, music, spirituality, complex social bonds, all of that happened during these lost 100,000 years. We're living in the aftermath of developments we can barely see. Scientists call parts of this era the Middle Paleolithic, the Upper Paleolithic, the Later Stone Age. These names sound authoritative, like we've got it all figured out. We don't. Each of these periods spans tens of thousands of years, and for huge stretches of them we're essentially guessing. It's like trying to understand a person's entire life story, but you only have photographs from when they were 5 years old, then 15, then 30, then 60. You can see they changed. You can guess at what happened in between, but you'd be missing almost everything that made them who they are. That's what we're dealing with when we try to understand humans from 100,000 to 12,000 years ago. We can see that something incredible happened. Apes became humans, not just anatomically, but behaviorally, cognitively, culturally. But the actual process, the details, the individual stories of adaptation and innovation and survival, most of those are hidden, locked away in sediments that have eroded into nothing or buried under hundreds of feet of ocean. Here's what we know happened during this period. Humans spread from Africa across the entire planet. They developed complex language sophisticated enough to tell stories about things that never existed. They created art that still moves us 40,000 years later. They survived climate swings that would make modern global warming look tame. They invented technologies, from tailored clothing to long-distance weapons, that had never existed before. They developed belief systems and burial rituals that suggest they were thinking about death and what might come after. They formed social bonds and exchange networks that connected people across thousands of miles. All of this happened. We have proof. What we don't have is the continuous record that would let us see how it happened. When exactly did humans develop full language? We don't know. The vocal apparatus was ready by 600,000 years ago, but complex grammatical language probably emerged much more recently, maybe around 70,000 years ago, maybe earlier. The evidence is maddeningly vague. When did humans first arrive in Australia? We know they were there by 65,000 years ago, maybe earlier. How did they cross nearly 60 miles of open ocean? We're not certain. What boats did they use? No idea. Wooden boats don't survive tens of thousands of years. When did humans develop religion? We see evidence of burial rituals going back 100,000 years. We see cave paintings with therianthropes, half-human, half-animal figures, suggesting shamanic beliefs 44,000 years ago. But when did humans first conceive of gods or spirits, or an afterlife? We'll probably never know. The archaeological record from the Middle Paleolithic is frustratingly sparse. We have evidence that humans were using ochre, red pigment, as far back as 285,000 years ago. But we don't know what they were doing with it. Body decoration, symbolic marking, art. The ochre is there. The context is gone. This is just the first gap, the first place where the story of human development becomes frustratingly unclear. And it won't be the last. Because here's the paradox that makes this period so fascinating and so maddening. We have better fossil records of Tyrannosaurus rex from 66 million years ago than we do of our own ancestors from 50,000 years ago. We can find nearly complete dinosaur skeletons. We can study their bone structure, analyze their growth patterns, determine what they ate and how they moved. Museums around the world display T-Rex skeletons that are 70, 80, sometimes 90% complete. But a human who died 40,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic, we're lucky if we find a jawbone and a few teeth. Most Paleolithic specimens are so fragmentary that we're reconstructing entire populations from partial skulls and scattered limb bones. The Denisovans, an entire human species that lived across Asia until maybe 30,000 years ago, we've found exactly one finger bone, a handful of teeth, and a piece of skull. That's it. That's everything we have from a species that was spread across millions of square miles and survived for hundreds of thousands of years. We've identified these people, mapped their genome, figured out they interbred with modern humans and Neanderthals, determined they adapted to high altitudes and developed maritime technologies, all from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave in 2008. It's absurd. It's like trying to reconstruct the entire history of the Roman Empire from a single coin and 3 bricks. And it gets worse because the Denisovans aren't alone. In 2004, scientists discovered Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits, on an Indonesian island, a completely unknown human species that survived until maybe 50,000 years ago. We had no idea they existed. None. Then suddenly we're digging up skeletons of 3-foot-tall humans with brains the size of chimpanzees who somehow figured out how to make sophisticated stone tools and hunt dwarf elephants. How do you lose an entire human species? How do you lose multiple human species? These aren't microscopic organisms. These are large mammals with complex social structures who made tools, used fire, buried their dead. They left footprints. They created archaeological sites. They should be everywhere in the fossil record. But they're not. They're ghosts, shadows. We know they existed only because of a handful of chance discoveries in caves and volcanic ash deposits where conditions happened to be perfect for preservation. So tonight we're going on a journey through this lost world, through the 100,000 years that science can barely document but can't fully explain, through the millennia of missing time that separate anatomically modern humans from behaviourally modern civilization. We're going to explore what we know, what we suspect, and what remains frustratingly, beautifully mysterious about humanity's hidden history. Close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's fall asleep thinking about the 100,000 years that made our world and then vanished into deep time. Let's talk about the world your ancestors woke up to 100,000 years ago. Because here's the thing, it wasn't Earth as you know it, not even close. The planet they inherited was alien in ways that would terrify most modern humans. Colder, wilder, populated by creatures that exist now only in nightmares and museum displays. And it was about to get much, much worse. 100,000 years ago, Earth was entering what scientists call the last glacial period. Not an ice age, that's a common misconception. We're technically still in an ice age that began 2.6 million years ago. What your ancestors were facing was a glacial period within the ice age, a time when the planet's temperature was about to plummet, when ice sheets miles thick would advance from the poles, when sea levels would drop by more than 400 feet, exposing vast stretches of continental shelf that are now deep underwater. Picture this. You're standing on what will one day be the coast of France, but there is no coast. The ocean is so far away you can't see it. Between you and the water are hundreds of miles of exposed seafloor, now dry land covered in grass and scattered trees. Mammoths graze in herds so large they blacken the horizon. Giant cave bears, standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs, hunt the same valleys where you're camped. Woolly rhinoceroses, their horns longer than your arm, plough through snow looking for buried vegetation. This isn't fantasy. This is Europe during the glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago. But the journey to that frozen extreme began much earlier. 100,000 years ago, the climate was entering a period of instability that would last for the next 90,000 years. Temperatures didn't just drop steadily, they swung wildly. A 1,000-year period of relative warmth would give way to several thousand years of brutal cold. Then it would warm again, then freeze, over and over, in cycles that made long-term planning nearly impossible. During the coldest phases, ice sheets covered most of Canada, all of Scandinavia, much of northern Europe and Russia. The ice was thick enough to press the land beneath it down by hundreds of feet. The weight of frozen water, miles deep, literally deformed the Earth's crust, and at the edges of these ice sheets, the world became a frozen desert. Winds screaming down from the glaciers created a landscape called Mammoth Steppe. Not tundra, which is too cold and wet. Not grassland, which is too warm. Something in between. A cold, dry prairie that stretched from Spain to Alaska, from Britain to China. Millions of square miles of grass and low shrubs, frozen solid for 8 months of the year, briefly green during the short summer. Your ancestors lived in this world. They had to. Because here's what makes this period so remarkable. Humans didn't retreat to the tropics and wait for the ice to melt. They stayed. They adapted. They spread across these frozen landscapes and learned to thrive in conditions that seem impossible to survive. Archaeological sites from this period show human presence far into the glaciated zones. Not just hanging on at the edges, but actively living, hunting, raising families in places where winter temperatures drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. How? That's one of the great mysteries of this period. We know they did it because we find their tools, their camps, their kill sites. We know they hunted mammoth and reindeer and bison across the frozen steppes. We know they built shelters and maintained fires and raised children who survived to have children of their own. What we don't fully understand is how they did all this without the advantages of modern technology. Without metal tools or insulated shelters or any of the infrastructure that makes modern Arctic living possible. But the cold was only part of the challenge. Because your ancestors also had to share this landscape with megafauna that make modern predators look tame. Imagine you're tracking a herd of reindeer across the steppe. You need to make this kill. Your group hasn't eaten meat in days. Winter is coming and you need the fat, the protein, the warm hides. But you're not the only predator watching this herd. Cave lions, larger than modern lions, are stalking from the other side. A pack of wolves, each one bigger than any wolf alive today, circles downwind. And in the distance, a short-faced bear, the largest land predator of the Pleistocene, stands 13 feet tall and weighs 1,700 pounds. It can run faster than a horse, and its jaws can crush mammoth bones. This was daily reality for humans during this period. Not occasional danger, but constant awareness that you are not the apex predator. You're clever, yes. You have weapons and fire and the ability to plan, but you're still prey. Still vulnerable, still mortal in a landscape filled with creatures that can kill you without effort. The saber-toothed cats, with their 8-inch canines designed to pierce thick hide and sever major blood vessels. The dire wolves, hunting in packs of 30 or more. The giant hyenas, scavengers powerful enough to drive humans from their kills. And it wasn't just the predators. The herbivores were equally dangerous. Woolly mammoths stood 14 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed 12 tons. They had tusks that curved up and out, sometimes 16 feet long, perfect for hooking and tossing anything that annoyed them, including humans. Woolly rhinos were smaller but more aggressive, territorial beasts that would charge without warning. Giant elk, their antlers spanning 12 feet, could gore a human as easily as a modern moose can. Even the horses were dangerous. Ice Age horses were stockier and more aggressive than modern breeds, with powerful kicks that could shatter bones. Living among these creatures required skills we've mostly lost. Your ancestors needed to read animal behavior perfectly. A slight change in a mammoth's posture could mean the difference between a successful hunt and being trampled. The sound of a cave lion's growl, the pattern of wolf tracks in the snow, the way a herd of bison shifted and shuffled, all of it had to be understood instantly. Interpreted correctly or you died. There was no room for error, no second chances. But here's what's really remarkable about this period. Despite all these dangers, despite the cold and the predators and the constant threat of starvation your ancestors were spreading, moving into new territories, exploring landscapes no human had ever seen. By 100,000 years ago, modern humans had already left Africa and were expanding into the Middle East. By 80,000 years ago, they were in Arabia. By 70,000 years ago, they were approaching India. And by 65,000 years ago, they had crossed open ocean and reached Australia. Think about what that means. These weren't gradual expansions into adjacent territories. These were deliberate journeys into unknown lands. Nobody was mapping these routes. There were no guides, no knowledge of what lay ahead. Your ancestors walked into complete uncertainty, following coastlines and river valleys and animal migration routes, moving ever outward from Africa into a world they had never seen. And somehow they survived. Not just survived, but thrived well enough to keep moving, keep exploring, keep pushing into new environments. The geography they encountered was dramatically different from today. With so much water locked up in ice, sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than present. This exposed enormous areas of continental shelf. The Indonesian archipelago became a single landmass called Sunderland, bigger than India. You could walk from Thailand to Borneo without getting your feet wet. The British Isles were connected to mainland Europe by a region called Doggerland, a vast low-lying territory of rivers and marshes and forests that's now entirely underwater. Between Siberia and Alaska, the Bering Land Bridge was hundreds of miles wide, a grassy steppe that connected two continents. These exposed lands weren't barren seafloor, they were productive territories. River valleys cutting through the continental shelf supported rich ecosystems. Coastal plains that are now submarine canyons were hunting grounds for mammoths and horses. Marshlands that are now deep ocean were bird rookeries where humans could gather eggs by the thousands. Some of the richest, most resource-abundant landscapes your ancestors inhabited are now permanently underwater, drowned when the glaciers melted and sea levels rose. We'll never find the archaeological sites from those regions. Never excavate the settlements that probably existed on those productive coastal plains. The evidence is gone, buried under hundreds of feet of water and marine sediment. This is why the fossil record from this period is so frustrating. We're not just missing random archaeological sites, we're missing entire categories of human habitation. If your ancestors were coastal people, living along those Ice Age shorelines, following marine resources and seasonal fish runs, we have almost no evidence of their existence. The camps where they lived, the tools they made, the refuse heaps that would tell us what they ate, all of it is underwater now, out of reach of archaeologists, slowly being destroyed by ocean currents and marine organisms. What we can see are the inland sites, the caves where people sheltered during winter. The kill sites far from ancient coastlines where mammoth bones have been preserved in frozen ground. The rock shelters in river valleys where stone tools accumulated over millennia. These give us glimpses of how your ancestors lived, but they're a biased sample. They show us only the humans who lived in places where fossilization was likely. The coastal peoples, the riverine fishing communities, the groups who might have lived very different lives, they're invisible. Even in the sites we can study, the picture is incomplete. Organic materials decay, wood rots, leather disintegrates, plant fibers vanish. What survives is stone, bone, occasionally some charcoal from ancient fires. From these durable fragments, we try to reconstruct entire cultures. It's like trying to understand modern civilization from nothing but concrete foundations and metal tools. You could see that buildings existed, that people had technology, but you'd miss almost everything about how they actually lived. Their art, their clothing, their food, their stories, all the things that make a culture meaningful, mostly gone. Yet despite these limitations, despite the gaps and the missing evidence and the drowned landscapes, we can still see the outline of what happened during this period. Humans entered a world of ice and megafauna and brutal climate swings, and instead of dying out, instead of retreating to easier territories, they adapted, they innovated, they spread across a planet that should have killed them. The world they inherited was hostile beyond imagining, but it was also their making. Every pressure, every danger, every near-extinction event shaped them into something new, something that could survive anything Earth threw at it. And that transformation, that journey from African ape to global species, that's what we're going to explore next. Now we need to talk about what it actually meant to be alive during this period. Not the grand sweep of human expansion, or the dramatic story of megafauna extinctions. The mundane, brutal, beautiful reality of waking up each morning in a world without cities, without agriculture, without any of the infrastructure that makes modern life survivable. Because here's what most people don't understand about this period. Your ancestors weren't just surviving, they were working harder than you've ever worked in your life, every single day, just to stay alive. Wake up before dawn in winter on the mammoth steppe. The fire you built last night has burned down to coals. The temperature outside your shelter is 30 below zero. Your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. Your fingers and toes are numb despite the layers of fur and hide you're wearing. You're hungry. You're always hungry during winter because the group hasn't made a major kill in 8 days, and the dried meat reserves are running low. Today you need to hunt. Not want to, need to. Because if you don't eat protein and fat soon, you'll start losing strength. And on the Ice Age steppe, weakness equals death. But hunting in winter isn't like summer hunting. The reindeer herds have migrated south following the brief growing season. The mammoths are scattered, harder to track in the snow. The cave lions and wolves are hungrier than you are, more desperate, more willing to fight for any kill. You need to find game, track it without being detected, get close enough for your weapons to be effective, make the kill before predators arrive, and then defend the carcass long enough to butcher what you need. All of this in temperatures that can freeze exposed skin in minutes. This was daily reality for tens of thousands of years. Not occasional hardship, but constant effort just to meet basic needs. Food, water, shelter, warmth. The 4 requirements that consumed almost every waking hour. And the margin for error was razor thin. One bad decision, one moment of inattention, one unlucky encounter with a predator or a sudden storm, and you were done. Your group would mourn you maybe if they had time. But mostly they'd move on because they had to. Survival didn't pause for grief. Let's break down what hunting actually involved during this period. Your primary weapons were spears, not the metal-tipped spears of later eras, but stone points hafted to wooden shafts with plant fibre cordage and tree resin adhesive. Making one spear properly took hours. First you needed to find the right stone, usually flint or obsidian or chert. Not just any piece, but one with the right grain structure that would flake predictably. Then you needed to nap it, striking the stone with precisely controlled blows to create a symmetrical point with sharp edges. One mistake and the point would shatter. You'd have to start over. Assuming you successfully created the point, now you needed a shaft. Straight-grained wood, preferably ash or birch. Seasoned properly so it wouldn't warp. You'd straighten it over fire, patient work that took hours more, then hafting the point to the shaft. This required precise notching, binding with sinew or plant fibre, sealing with heated tree resin. The whole process from finding raw materials to finished spear could take a full day or longer. And you needed multiple spears because they broke. They shattered against mammoth ribs. They were lost when wounded animals ran off with them embedded. They cracked in the cold. With your spears ready, now you had to actually find game. This meant understanding animal behaviour at a level modern people can barely comprehend. You needed to know where different species would be at different times of year, which valleys held reindeer in autumn, which riverbanks bison preferred in spring, where mammoths went during severe cold snaps. You tracked by reading sign, footprints in mud or snow, yes, but also broken branches, disturbed vegetation, scratch marks on trees, the specific pattern of droppings left by different animals. And tracking meant exposure. You couldn't track from inside a warm shelter. You were out in the elements for hours, sometimes days, following herds across open landscape. Your feet would go numb in your fur boots. Your face would burn from wind and cold. You'd drink from frozen streams, melt snow in your mouth for water. You'd eat whatever you could gather along the way. Nuts if you were lucky, bark if you weren't. And all the while you had to remain alert because you weren't the only thing hunting. When you finally located your prey, the real danger began. Hunting megafauna wasn't like hunting modern deer. These were animals that could kill you effortlessly if you made a mistake. A mammoth could crush you with one step. A bison could gore you with a toss of its head. Even horses could kick with enough force to shatter your skull. So you didn't just run up and start throwing spears. You planned, you waited, you looked for the young, the old, the sick, the individuals separated from the herd, the ones where you had a chance. Some researchers think humans practice persistence hunting, running prey to exhaustion over many hours. This works in hot climates where humans can sweat and animals overheat. But in the Ice Age cold, probably not. More likely your ancestors used ambush tactics, driving animals into box canyons, stampeding herds toward cliffs where some would fall. Waiting at waterholes where animals had to drink, using the landscape as a weapon because your physical weapons weren't powerful enough to bring down a mammoth from a distance. And when you finally made a kill, your work was just beginning. A mammoth carcass weighs 6 to 8 tons. You can't move it. You have to butcher it where it fell, working as fast as possible before scavengers arrive, and they will arrive. The smell of blood carries for miles. Cave lions, wolves, hyenas, they're all coming. You need to work fast, cutting away the most valuable parts. The tongue, rich in fat. The organs packed with nutrients. The back fat, essential for surviving winter. The leg bones with their calorie-dense marrow. You're covered in blood, your hands numb from the cold and the wet, working with stone tools that need constant resharpening. You're watching the tree line for movement because predators don't always wait for you to finish. Sometimes they challenge you for the kill. Then you have to decide, fight or flee, Risk death over meat or go hungry another day? There was no right answer. Both choices could kill you. Assuming you successfully defended your kill and butchered what you could carry, now you had to get it back to camp. Mammoth meat is heavy. A single leg could weigh hundreds of pounds. You're carrying what you can, maybe 60 or 80 pounds on your back, walking through snow or across frozen ground, hoping you can remember the way back, hoping the weather doesn't change, hoping you don't encounter predators while loaded down with meat. Back at camp, if you made it, the real work of food processing began. Meat had to be distributed according to complex social rules that anthropologists are still trying to understand. The hunters got shares, obviously. But so did the children, the elderly, the individuals who'd been unable to hunt due to injury or illness. Sharing wasn't charity, it was insurance. Today you couldn't hunt, tomorrow I might not be able to. We all survive or we all die, so we share. Then, preservation. In winter, freezing did most of the work. You could cache meat in snowdrifts, bury it in permafrost, leave it hanging in trees where the cold kept it edible for weeks. But what about summer? Then you needed to smoke the meat over low fires, dry it in the sun, render the fat and store it in hide containers. You had to work constantly to keep food from spoiling because there was no refrigeration, no preservation technology beyond what you could improvise. And while all this hunting and butchering and preserving was happening, someone had to maintain the fire. This might sound simple, it's not. Fire during the Ice Age was life itself. Without it, you froze at night. Without it, you couldn't cook food or render fat or keep predators at bay. So fire had to burn continuously, winter and summer, day and night. This meant constant fuel gathering. Wood, dried dung, bone, anything that would burn. In forested areas, fine. In the treeless steppe, you were burning mammoth bones and dried grass and hoping it was enough. Starting a fire from scratch was a multi-hour process. Friction methods, spinning a wooden drill against a wooden base until the heat created an ember. Then carefully transferring that ember to tinder, blowing gently to coax it into flame, adding larger pieces gradually until you had sustainable fire. Mess up any step and you started over. So fires were kept burning if at all possible. Someone always on watch, adding fuel, protecting the flames from wind and rain. Losing your fire in winter could mean death for the entire group. Shelter was the other constant concern. In summer, simple structures might suffice. Frameworks of branches covered with hides, easy to dismantle and move as the group followed game. But winter demanded more. Archaeological evidence shows humans building substantial dwellings during the glacial periods. The mammoth bone houses found in Ukraine and Russia are the most famous examples. Circular structures 15 to 20 feet across, built from hundreds of mammoth bones arranged in careful patterns. Skulls for the base, long bones for the walls, tusks for the roof framework, covered with hides and turf for insulation. These structures took enormous effort to build. Mammoth bones had to be gathered from multiple carcasses, transported to the building site, arranged in stable configurations. The work probably took weeks and required coordinated effort from multiple people. But once built, these shelters could last for years, providing reliable protection from the brutal steppe winters. Inside, with a fire burning and multiple people sharing body heat, temperatures could reach almost comfortable levels even when it was -40 outside. But even in these shelters, life was hard. Smoke from the fire filled the interior because efficient chimneys hadn't been invented yet. Your eyes burned, your lungs ached. You lived in a constant grey haze. Parasites were everywhere. Lice in your hair and clothing, fleas in the bedding, worms in your digestive system from eating undercooked meat, infections from cuts and scrapes that had no antibiotics to treat them, dental problems from grit in food that wore down teeth to nubs, and children. Raising children in this environment required resources and attention that strained every group. Infants needed constant care, food, warmth. They couldn't contribute to survival for years. They were vulnerable to disease, to cold, to predators. Yet groups invested enormous effort in keeping them alive because children were the future. Without them, the group died out. So adults shared food with children even when they were hungry themselves, protected them even at risk to their own lives, taught them skills that took years to master, This teaching was crucial. Unlike in modern schools where knowledge is written down and standardized, everything your ancestors knew had to be transmitted orally, through demonstration and practice: how to knap stone, how to track animals, how to read weather, how to find edible plants, how to start fire, how to treat injuries. All of it passed from generation to generation through watching and doing and remembering. Lose that knowledge and you died. Forget how to make fire and your group froze. Forget which plants were poisonous and your children starved. So daily life during this period was a grinding cycle of work. Wake up cold and hungry, gather food or hunt, process what you found, maintain your tools, tend the fire, care for children, repair clothing and shelter, watch for danger. Try to sleep despite the cold and the hunger, and the ever-present awareness that tomorrow you'd do it all again, and the next day, and the next, for your entire life. This was what it meant to be human 100,000 years ago. Not the romantic notion of noble savages living in harmony with nature, not the crude stereotypes of brutish cavemen, but real people, as intelligent as anyone alive today, working desperately hard to survive in conditions that would kill most modern humans within days. They weren't more primitive, they were more skilled, more knowledgeable about their environment, more capable of enduring hardship than almost anyone alive now. They had to be. The world gave them no choice. But something else was happening during this period. Something invisible, impossible to excavate, harder to trace than stone tools or mammoth bones. Somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, the human mind changed. Not anatomically. The brain case was already modern-sized. The neural architecture was in place. But cognitively, behaviourally, something fundamental shifted, and we're still trying to figure out what it was. Scientists call this the cognitive revolution, though that term is contested and probably overly dramatic. It wasn't a single moment. There was no sudden mutation that made humans smart. Instead, what seems to have happened is a gradual accumulation of capabilities that, at some threshold point, triggered a cascade of changes. Language became more complex. Symbolic thought emerged. The ability to imagine things that didn't exist, to plan for distant futures, to create art and ritual and belief systems, all of this crystallized during this period. The evidence appears first in Africa. Around 100,000 years ago, at sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa, we start finding things that suggest modern cognition. Shell beads, deliberately pierced and strung, clearly meant for personal adornment. Pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns, abstract designs that serve no functional purpose. Bone tools shaped with care that goes beyond mere utility. These artifacts are scattered, sporadic. They appear, then disappear from the archaeological record for thousands of years, then reappear. It's frustrating, this flickering signal of modernity, but around 70,000 years ago the signal strengthens. The archaeological sites from this period show a marked increase in artifact diversity, more types of tools, more sophisticated hafting techniques, where stone points are attached to wooden shafts with compound adhesives made from multiple ingredients, evidence of heat treatment, where stone is carefully heated to change its flaking properties, making it easier to work into finer, sharper tools. This isn't just practical knowledge. This is chemistry, physics, material science understood through trial and error and passed down through generations. And then there's language, the most important development in human evolution, and the one that leaves almost no archaeological trace. We know humans had the physical apparatus for speech by 600,000 years ago. The descended larynx, the precise neural control of breathing, the tongue structure, all the anatomical requirements were in place long before modern behaviour appeared. But anatomy isn't language. Chimpanzees can vocalize, but they can't speak, because they lack the cognitive architecture to generate and comprehend complex grammar. So when did humans develop full language? Not just calls and gestures, but recursive syntactic language with embedded clauses and abstract concepts, and the ability to talk about things that aren't physically present. We don't know, not precisely, but the evidence suggests it happened during this period, somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, maybe earlier. The archaeological signature is indirect but compelling. Complex technology requires verbal instruction. You can learn simple stone knapping by watching and imitating. But the sophisticated tools that appear around 70,000 years ago, the composite weapons with their multiple components and adhesives, the heat-treated projectile points, these require explanation. You need words to teach someone how to select the right plant gum, mix it with ochre and fat, heat it to the correct temperature, apply it to a stone point and wooden shaft in a way that creates a durable bond. Demonstration helps, but language is essential. The same applies to the long-distance movement of materials that archaeologists find during this period. Ochre transported hundreds of miles from its source. High-quality stone carried across landscapes. Marine shells found far inland. Freshwater shells discovered at coastal sites. This suggests exchange networks, trade relationships between groups that might never meet face to face, and trade requires communication, not just gestures, but the ability to negotiate, to establish value, to create obligations that persist over time. That requires language. But here's what really points to language emerging during this period: the explosion of symbolic artifacts. Because symbols only work if they have shared meaning. If I give you a shell bead and it means something to you, we need a common framework of understanding. That bead might represent group membership. It might mark social status. It might be a gift that creates an obligation. Whatever it means, we both have to understand it. And that shared symbolic understanding almost certainly requires language. The geometric engravings found on ochre and ostrich eggshells from this period suggest even more. These aren't representational. They're not pictures of animals or people. They're abstract patterns, cross-hatching, parallel lines, zigzags. Some researchers think these might have been identifying marks, symbols that represented groups or individuals. Others suggest they could be early notation systems, ways of recording information. Either way, they demonstrate that humans were thinking in symbols, creating meaning from marks that had no intrinsic significance. And then, around 70,000 years ago, something remarkable happens. The archaeological record shows humans using pigments not just for marking objects, but possibly for decorating their own bodies. Red ochre becomes ubiquitous at sites across Africa and the Middle East. We find grinding stones with ochre residue. We find ochre mixed with fat to create paste. We find stains that suggest it was applied to hide or skin. Body decoration is one of the most distinctively human behaviours. No other species paints itself, and it requires a level of self-awareness, of concern with appearance and social signalling that suggests fully modern cognition. This is also when we see evidence of increasingly complex burial practices. Early burials, going back 100,000 years or more, are simple. A body placed in a shallow grave, maybe a few objects scattered nearby. But by 70,000 years ago, some burials show clear intentionality, bodies positioned deliberately, grave goods that seem carefully selected, ochre sprinkled on the corpse. These practices suggest beliefs about death, possibly about an afterlife, and belief in things you can't see, in realms beyond the physical world. That's abstract thought of the highest order. The cognitive revolution, if we can call it that, wasn't about becoming smarter. Your ancestors from 100,000 years ago had the same brain capacity you do. They were just as intelligent, just as capable of learning and reasoning and solving problems. What changed wasn't intelligence, but something more subtle. The ability to think symbolically, to imagine counterfactuals, to tell stories about things that never happened, and understand that those stories weren't literally true but still carried meaning. This is what separates modern human cognition from everything that came before. Neanderthals were intelligent. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, cared for their sick and elderly. But the archaeological evidence suggests they didn't think symbolically the way modern humans do. They didn't create art or wear jewellery or bury their dead with grave goods in ways that suggest belief in an afterlife. Or if they did it so rarely and inconsistently that it doesn't show up clearly in the fossil record. Modern humans, by contrast, seem to have been obsessed with symbols from at least 70,000 years ago onward. Everything had meaning. Objects weren't just functional, they were emblematic. Shells weren't just pretty, they represented something. Ochre wasn't just pigment, it had ritual significance. This symbolic obsession is what makes us human in a cognitive sense, and it appears to have emerged, or at least become dominant during this period. But why then? What triggered this shift? Some researchers think it was a genetic mutation. perhaps in the FOXP2 gene that's involved in language development. A small change in how this gene functioned could have refined the neural architecture for complex grammar, and that refinement would have spread rapidly through populations because individuals with better language ability would have had enormous advantages. They could teach more effectively, coordinate more successfully, form larger and more stable social groups. Others argue against a genetic explanation. They point out that symbolic behavior appears sporadically in the archaeological record before 70,000 years ago, then disappears, then reappears. This flickering suggests that the capability was already present but wasn't being expressed consistently. Maybe because populations were small and isolated. Maybe because environmental pressures didn't favour the investment of time and resources required for art and ritual. Maybe because the cultural transmission of symbolic practices was fragile and easily lost. Then, around 70,000 years ago, something changed. Perhaps population sizes increased, creating denser social networks where symbolic practices could be transmitted more reliably. Perhaps climate pressures forced groups into closer contact, accelerating cultural exchange. Perhaps some key innovation in social organization, in teaching methods, in how knowledge was shared between generations, pushed symbolic behavior past a threshold where it became self-sustaining. We don't know. We're guessing based on fragmentary evidence from sites scattered across thousands of miles and thousands of years. What we do know is that by 60,000 years ago, when humans began their great expansion out of Africa, they were behaviorally modern. They had language, symbolic thought, complex social structures. They could plan for the future, remember the past, imagine alternatives to their current situation. They could tell stories, create myths, develop belief systems that bound groups together and gave meaning to the suffering and joy of existence. They were, in every cognitive sense, us. And this matters because the next 90,000 years of human history, everything that happened between the cognitive revolution and the agricultural revolution, was shaped by these newly emerged capabilities. Your ancestors didn't just survive the Ice Age through physical adaptations, they survived through cooperation enabled by language, through innovation driven by symbolic thought, through social bonds strengthened by shared beliefs and rituals. The human mind, modern and complex and capable of abstractions that no other species can grasp, that's what carried them through the hardest 100,000 years in human history. But consciousness and cognition don't fossilize. We can't excavate thought. We can only infer it from the things people left behind. The beads they wore, the ochre they ground, the patterns they carved into stone and bone and shell. Each artifact is a message from minds that worked like ours, from people who wondered about the same things we wonder about. Where do we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? They didn't have answers any more than we do. But they asked the questions, and in asking they became human in a way their ancestors never had been, and then they started painting. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in caves scattered across the world, humans began creating images that still take your breath away 40,000 years later. This is where the cognitive revolution becomes visible, where abstract thought and symbolic meaning manifest as art so powerful it transcends the millennia between their world and ours. Your ancestors weren't just surviving anymore, they were creating. The oldest known cave paintings aren't in Europe, though that's where they were first recognized. They're in Indonesia. On the island of Sulawesi, in a cave called Liangtedongge, researchers found a painting of a warty pig executed at least 45,500 years ago. Not a crude stick figure. A naturalistic representation showing anatomical details, individual features, the kind of observation that only comes from really looking at an animal, understanding it, seeing it as more than just food or threat, but as a subject worthy of permanent depiction. But even more remarkable is another Indonesian cave, Liang Bulu Sipong 4. Here, researchers found the world's oldest known narrative scene. Not just individual animals, but a story. At least 44,000 years ago, someone painted a hunting scene showing small figures, apparently human but with animal characteristics, pursuing what appears to be a buffalo-like creature. Therianthropes, half human, half animal. The kind of composite beings that appear in mythologies around the world, but which, in this cave, date back to the early days of behaviorally modern humans. Think about what this represents. The artist wasn't just recording what they saw, they were imagining something that didn't exist, creating a visual representation of a concept. These therianthropes might have been shamans in ritual costume, they might have been spirits or gods, they might have been ancestors transformed by death into something more than human. Whatever they represented, they demonstrate that your ancestors, 44,000 years ago, were thinking about the relationship between humans and animals in ways that went beyond predator and prey. They were creating mythology. Meanwhile, in Europe, a different artistic tradition was emerging. The cave paintings of France and Spain, discovered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric humans. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira. These aren't random scribbles or primitive doodles. These are sophisticated works of art created by people who understood perspective, shading, the use of natural cave contours to create three-dimensional effects. Some of the paintings are so refined that early researchers refused to believe they were prehistoric. Surely, they argued, these had to be recent forgeries. Ancient humans couldn't have been this skilled. They were wrong. The paintings are real, dated to between 40,000 and 15,000 years ago. They represent a sustained artistic tradition that lasted for 25,000 years. Think about that. 25,000 years. For context, all of recorded human history from the first writing to now spans only about 5,000 years. The cave painting tradition lasted 5 times longer than all of civilization. And what they painted tells us so much about how they thought. The animals dominate: horses, bison, aurochs, mammoths, reindeer, cave lions, rhinoceroses. Rendered with such care and detail that modern zoologists can identify specific species, sometimes specific ages and sexes. The artists knew these animals intimately, how they moved, how their muscles bunched under their skin, how light fell on their coats. This wasn't casual observation. This was knowledge earned through constant attention, through lives spent tracking and watching and hunting these creatures. But notice what's missing. Human figures are rare in European cave art. When they do appear, they're often simplified, schematic, not given the same attention to detail as the animals. Why? Some researchers think it's because the animals were spiritually significant in ways humans weren't. That the caves were sacred spaces where the spirits of animals were honoured or propitiated. That painting them was a ritual act, not just artistic expression, but religious practice bound up with beliefs about successful hunts and the relationship between humans and the animal world. Others point to the deep locations of many paintings. These aren't near cave entrances where people lived. They're far back in the darkness, in chambers that require crawling through narrow passages, sometimes descending hundreds of feet underground. Getting to these painting sites would have been dangerous, disorienting, claustrophobic. The journey itself might have been part of the ritual, a vision quest into the underworld where normal rules didn't apply and contact with the spirit realm was possible. And the paintings aren't the only art. Scattered throughout these caves, researchers have found hand stencils, hundreds of them, made by placing a hand against the cave wall and blowing pigment around it, creating a negative image. These handprints are haunting. They're personal in a way the animal paintings aren't. Each one is an individual, a specific person who stood in this dark cave tens of thousands of years ago and left their mark. Some of the hands are small, possibly children. Some are missing fingers, whether from injury or deliberate amputation, we don't know. But they're all reaching out across time, saying, "I was here, I existed, remember me." The pigments themselves tell a story. Red ochre dominates, but there's also black from charcoal or manganese dioxide, white from clay or calcite, yellow from other iron oxides. These weren't just found lying around, they had to be sourced, sometimes from locations miles from the cave, ground into powder mixed with binders like animal fat or plant gum or eggs. The preparation was complex, time-consuming, requiring knowledge of chemistry that had to be learned and transmitted. Someone had to teach the artist how to make paint, had to show them which stones produced which colours, how to grind them, what to mix them with, how to apply them to cave walls in ways that would last. And last they did. 40,000 years later, the paintings remain vivid. The ochre reds and charcoal blacks still vibrant on stone walls. This wasn't luck. The artists chose their materials carefully, understanding that certain pigments bonded better to certain surfaces. They prepared the walls, sometimes scraping away loose material, sometimes working with the natural texture of the stone. They used scaffolding to reach high surfaces, evidence of which has been found in some caves. They work by firelight or by lamplight from animal fat burning in stone lamps, creating art in darkness that was meant to be viewed in darkness. But why? That's the question that haunts every researcher who studies cave art. Why invest such enormous effort in creating images deep underground where almost no one would see them? If it was just aesthetic, just art for art's sake, you'd expect it near habitation areas where people could enjoy it daily. The fact that so much cave art is in remote, hard-to-access locations suggests it served purposes beyond decoration. The religious interpretation makes sense in many ways. Almost every known human culture has spiritual or religious practices. The impulse to explain the inexplicable, to find meaning in suffering and death, to imagine powers beyond human control that might be influenced through ritual, this appears to be universal. Your ancestors facing the brutality of Ice Age existence would have had every reason to develop such beliefs. When a hunt succeeded or failed for no obvious reason, when illness struck or passed, when some children survived and others didn't despite equal care, invoking supernatural forces would have made the randomness more bearable. And the therianthropes, those half-human, half-animal figures, they fit perfectly into shamanic traditions documented among hunter-gatherers worldwide. The shaman who mediates between human and spirit worlds, who dons animal skins and masks to commune with animal spirits, who enters trance states through dance or drugs or sensory deprivation, and journeys to other realms. These practices are ancient and widespread. The cave paintings might document such rituals. The therianthropes might be shamans in ceremonial dress. The deep cave locations might be where these rituals occurred, far from the mundane world of the surface. But there are other interpretations. Some researchers think the caves were teaching tools, that the paintings served to instruct young hunters about animal behavior and anatomy, that the act of painting was itself a learning exercise, forcing the artist to observe and understand their prey in ways that would improve hunting success. The emphasis on certain body parts, the exaggerated antlers on some deer, the prominent bellies on pregnant animals, these could be highlighting features important for hunters to recognize. Still others suggest the caves were simply special places, that creating art in difficult locations was about demonstrating skill, about young people proving themselves worthy of adult status. That the journey into the depths and the creation of paintings under challenging conditions was an initiation rite. That the hand stencils weren't religious at all, but more like signing a guest book, a way of recording presence at a significant location. We'll probably never know the true purpose. The artist left no written explanations. The rituals, if they were rituals, died with the last practitioners. What we have are the paintings themselves and the questions they raise. But maybe that's enough, because what the cave art proves, beyond any doubt, is that your ancestors 40,000 years ago had minds like yours. They saw beauty and created it. They wondered about their place in the world and tried to express those wonderings through art. They invested time and effort in activities that had no immediate survival value because they valued something beyond mere survival. They were human, fully, completely human. Not proto-humans or primitive ancestors struggling towards civilization. They were us, separated only by time and circumstance. They loved and feared and hoped and mourned. They told stories around fires. They cared for their children. They buried their dead with ceremony. They painted in dark caves, creating beauty that would outlast them by 40,000 years. And in doing so, they left us a message. We are not so different, you and I. We wondered about the same things. We felt the same emotions. Across all the millennia that separate us, we are connected. We are family. That's what the cave art really tells us. Not just that humans could create beauty, though they could, but that they needed to. That even in the hardest circumstances imaginable, facing constant danger and deprivation, they still found time and energy for art and ritual and the creation of meaning. They still asked the big questions and tried to answer them through symbol and story. They were doing what humans do, what we still do, trying to make sense of existence, to find purpose in the struggle, to leave something behind that says we mattered. We were here, we lived. But humans didn't survive the Ice Age through art alone. They survived through each other, through social bonds so strong that individuals would sacrifice for the group, through cooperative networks that allowed the sharing of resources and knowledge across generations and even between unrelated bands, through relationships that went far beyond the simple family structures of other primates. This is where human evolution becomes truly unique, not in our tools or our brains, but in how we organized ourselves socially. Your ancestors lived in small groups, probably between 20 and 50 individuals, though this number varied based on resources and season. Too few and you couldn't hunt effectively, couldn't defend against predators, couldn't maintain a viable breeding population. Too many, and you'd exhaust local resources too quickly, creating competition that would fracture the group. So bands stayed relatively small, intimate enough that everyone knew everyone else, that cooperation was based on personal relationships rather than abstract social contracts. But these weren't isolated families. Archaeological evidence shows extensive contact between groups. High-quality stone tools found hundreds of miles from their source quarries. Marine shells discovered far inland. Distinctive art styles shared across regions. This wasn't trade in the modern sense. Nobody was running a business, but materials were moving, ideas were spreading, and that meant people from different groups were meeting, interacting, probably intermarrying. Because here's one of the great insights from modern genetics. Ice Age populations couldn't survive in isolation. The math is brutal. A group of 30 people has maybe 6 or 7 breeding pairs at any given time. Their children marry each other, have children, and within a few generations you're looking at dangerous levels of inbreeding. Genetic diversity collapses. Recessive disorders appear. The population weakens and eventually fails. To maintain viability, you need genetic exchange with other groups. Fresh blood, literally. And that means your ancestors had to maintain relationships with neighbouring bands even though they rarely saw them. This created something anthropologists call fission-fusion society. Groups would split during times of abundance, smaller bands spreading out to exploit resources over wider territories. Then they'd come back together during lean times, aggregating at reliable resource points. Waterholes in summer, salmon runs in autumn, reindeer migration routes in spring. These seasonal gatherings weren't just about food. They were social events where young people from different groups could meet potential mates, where knowledge could be exchanged, new techniques demonstrated, stories told, alliances formed. And within the groups, social structures were sophisticated in ways that kept everyone alive. Start with children. Human children are uniquely helpless among primates. They can't cling to their mothers like infant apes. They can't feed themselves for years. They require constant care, vigilant protection, patient teaching. No single parent, no single pair of parents could manage this alone while also securing food and maintaining shelter and doing all the other work required for survival. So Ice Age humans developed what anthropologists call cooperative breeding. The mother nursed and carried the infant, obviously, but others helped. Older siblings watched younger ones. Grandmothers, no longer bearing children themselves but still knowledgeable and capable, became essential caregivers. Aunts and uncles and cousins all participated in child rearing. The whole group invested in each child's survival because that child was the future. If they died, the group's genetic and cultural heritage died with them. This cooperative breeding had profound consequences. It meant women could have children more frequently than other great apes because they had help with childcare. It meant knowledge could be transmitted not just from parents to children, but from grandparents, from skilled practitioners who might not be related at all. It created multi-generational groups where elderly individuals, no longer able to hunt or gather effectively, still contributed through teaching and childcare and the accumulated wisdom of long experience. And that matters because humans are one of the few species where females regularly survive decades past their reproductive years. Menopause, the cessation of fertility while still maintaining health and strength, is rare in nature. Why would evolution favour it? The grandmother hypothesis suggests it's because post-reproductive women were so valuable to group survival that genes promoting longevity in females were strongly selected for. A grandmother who could teach plant lore, who could care for grandchildren while their mothers gathered food, who could mediate disputes and maintain social cohesion, she was worth more to the group alive than she would have been repeatedly risking death in childbirth. The evidence supports this. Burial sites from the Upper Paleolithic show individuals who lived to 60 or 70 years old, ancient by the standards of their time. Some show evidence of severe disabilities, injuries or illnesses that would have prevented them from hunting or even moving easily. Yet they survived for years after these disabilities appeared. Someone fed them. Someone cared for them. The group kept them alive despite the cost because human social bonds aren't purely transactional. They're emotional, ethical, bound up with concepts of loyalty and obligation that go beyond immediate survival calculations. Consider what this means. A hunter injured in a mammoth hunt, paralyzed perhaps, unable to contribute to food acquisition anymore. In most species, that individual would die, quickly. Natural selection doesn't favor expending resources on those who can't contribute. But humans are different. Your ancestors would care for that injured hunter, share food with him, keep him warm, protect him from predators, not because it made economic sense, because he was family, because he'd hunted for the group before, because abandoning him would violate social norms so fundamental that the group couldn't maintain cohesion if they were broken. This is what separates human social organization from that of other primates. Chimpanzees cooperate, yes. They hunt together, share food sometimes, form coalitions, but their cooperation is contingent, transactional, based on immediate reciprocity. I scratch your back now, you scratch mine later. If you stop being useful, the relationship ends. Human cooperation goes deeper. It's based on abstract concepts of fairness and reciprocity that extend across time. You helped me 5 years ago, I help you now. You can't help me today, but I help you anyway because you're part of my group and that's what we do. Evidence for this level of social complexity appears throughout the archaeological record. Burial practices are the most obvious indicator. By 50,000 years ago, humans were burying their dead with care that suggests emotional attachment and possibly belief in an afterlife. Bodies positioned deliberately, sometimes in fetal positions suggesting rebirth. Grave goods placed alongside, tools, shells, ochre, sometimes flowers based on pollen analysis. These weren't functional. The dead don't need tools. These were symbolic, meaningful, expressions of grief and love and hope. But there's more subtle evidence too. The distribution of food within sites. Chemical analysis of bones can show what people ate throughout their lives, and studies of Ice Age skeletons show surprising uniformity within groups. Everyone eating similar diets, getting similar nutrition. This suggests active food sharing, not just among hunters, but throughout the group. The successful hunters weren't hoarding the best cuts for themselves. They were distributing according to social rules that ensured everyone, young and old, strong and weak, got enough to survive. The care of tools and ornaments also tells a story. Some artifacts show evidence of curation, of being kept and maintained over long periods. A particularly well-made spear point passed from parent to child. A shell necklace worn for years, its surfaces polished by constant contact with skin. These weren't just possessions. They were heirlooms, objects with personal and social meaning that connected individuals to their ancestry, their group identity, their place in a social network that extended beyond the immediate present. And then there's the evidence of violence, because not all social interactions were positive. Skeletal remains from this period sometimes show evidence of trauma. Fractured skulls from blunt force, spear points embedded in bone. Individuals who died violently and whose bodies weren't carefully buried but left where they fell. This tells us that relations between groups could be hostile, that competition for resources sometimes led to conflict, that your ancestors faced threats not just from nature but from other humans. Yet the violence seems to have been limited. We don't see evidence of warfare in the modern sense. No fortified settlements, no caches of weapons beyond what would be used for hunting. No mass graves suggesting systematic extermination of rival groups. The violence appears to have been sporadic, individual conflicts or small-scale raids rather than organized warfare. Most of the time, most groups found ways to coexist, to share territories, to resolve conflicts without killing each other. This balance, between cooperation within groups and competition between them, shaped human evolution in profound ways. It selected for individuals who could read social cues, who understood complex unwritten rules, who could form alliances and navigate hierarchies and judge when to cooperate and when to compete. It created selection pressure for larger brains capable of tracking relationships between dozens of individuals. For theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts and feelings and motivations of their own. For empathy, the capacity to feel what others feel and respond to their emotional states. Your ancestors weren't just smart in the sense of being able to solve physical problems, they were socially intelligent in ways that most modern people couldn't match. They could read subtle shifts in body language, detect deception, remember complex networks of reciprocal obligations spanning years. They had to. Social mistakes could get you ostracized, and ostracism in the Ice Age was a death sentence. You couldn't survive alone, so you learnt the rules, you maintained your relationships, you contributed to the group in ways that ensured you'd be supported when you needed help. And those groups, those small bands of humans struggling through the Ice Age together, they were the foundation of everything that came after. The social structures they developed, the cooperative breeding and food sharing and care for the elderly, the complex networks of exchange and alliance between groups, the emotional bonds that held people together through hardship, all of this persisted. All of this shaped human nature in ways we still carry. We are a social species because our ancestors couldn't survive any other way. We cooperate because they had to. We form bonds and create meaning and care for each other, because those behaviors were written into our genes and our cultures over hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressure. The Ice Age didn't just shape our tools or our brains, it shaped how we relate to each other, how we build societies, how we balance self-interest against group welfare. The social bonds forged during those 100,000 years tested in the crucible of constant danger and deprivation. Those bonds made us human in the deepest sense. Not just intelligent animals, but people, connected, caring, capable of sacrifice and loyalty and love that transcends rational self-interest. That's the real legacy of this period. Not the cave paintings or the sophisticated tools, beautiful as those are, but the social fabric that held our ancestors together when everything else was trying to tear them apart. But social bonds alone don't keep you warm when it's 40 below zero. They don't put food in your stomach or protect you from cave lions. Your ancestors survived because they innovated constantly, developing technologies that had never existed before. And the most important innovation of all happened around 30,000 years ago. Something so simple, so seemingly insignificant, that it's easy to miss its revolutionary importance. The needle. A piece of bone or ivory, 3 or 4 inches long, polished smooth, with a hole carefully drilled through one end. This changed everything. Before the needle, humans wore clothing. We know this because body lice, which live in clothing rather than on skin, diverged from head lice around 170,000 years ago. So for tens of thousands of years, your ancestors were wrapping themselves in animal hides, draping furs over their shoulders, tying skins around their waists. Loose-fitting garments that provided some protection from cold but weren't particularly efficient. Air leaked in, heat leaked out. And in truly cold conditions, loose clothing wasn't enough. The needle allowed fitted clothing, garments that could be sewn to match body contours, creating layers of insulation that trapped air and retained heat. Sleeves that actually covered arms completely. Pants that protected legs. Hoods that shielded heads from wind. The difference between draped hides and tailored clothing is the difference between surviving winter and thriving in it. With proper fitted garments, humans could remain active in temperatures that would kill someone in loose wraps within hours. Think about what this required. First, someone had to conceive of the idea. To imagine clothing that fit rather than draped. To envision a way to join pieces of hide with stitches rather than just tying them together. Then someone had to create the tool, selecting bone or ivory with the right grain structure, shaping it into a thin shaft without breaking it, polishing it smooth so it would slide through leather. And here's the really difficult part, drilling a hole through one end small enough that thread could fit through, but the needle wouldn't break. This drilling was precision work. Too much pressure and the bone splits, too little, and you never penetrate all the way through. You need a drill bit, probably made from sharp stone or harder bone. You need steady hands and patient application of force. Some surviving needles show multiple attempted holes where the crafter failed several times before succeeding. Each attempt taking hours, each failure meaning you start over. But once you had a working needle, you'd unlocked a technology that would persist for thousands of years. The thread was its own challenge. Plant fibers work in warm climates, but they become brittle when frozen. animal sinew was better, stronger and more flexible in cold. But preparing sinew for use as thread requires processing. You have to harvest it from killed animals, clean it, dry it, split it into thin strands, sometimes soften it by chewing. The preparation takes time, but the result is thread strong enough to join thick leather, fine enough to create tight stitches, durable enough to last through seasons of wear. And the sewing itself required skill. Different stitches for different purposes, running stitches for seams that needed to be watertight, whip stitches for edges that needed reinforcement, the ability to judge how tight to pull thread, how far apart to space stitches, when to double back for strength. These skills had to be learned through practice, taught from experienced sewers to beginners. Someone had to be the first teacher, had to experiment and fail, and try again until they mastered the technique, then had to pass that knowledge on. The archaeological evidence for this technology is sparse because needles are small and delicate and rarely survive. But the ones we've found, dated to around 30,000 years ago, are sophisticated, polished smooth, precisely drilled, showing wear patterns from extensive use, and the impact was immediate. Around the same time needles appear, we start seeing evidence of human expansion into the coldest regions of Eurasia, Siberia, the Arctic Circle, places that had been uninhabitable without proper clothing technology. The needle opened new territories, allowed humans to thrive in environments no other primate could survive. But clothing wasn't the only innovation. Tool technology was evolving rapidly during this period. The stone tools that dominated earlier eras were giving way to more sophisticated composite tools. A spear wasn't just a sharpened stick anymore. It was a wooden shaft, carefully straightened and balanced, a stone point, precisely napped to specifications, bindings of sinew or plant fibre, adhesive made from tree resin or birch tar, often mixed with ochre and beeswax to create a compound glue with specific properties. Creating birch tar, one of the most common prehistoric adhesives, requires pyrotechnology that shouldn't be underestimated. You can't just heat birch bark over a fire. That produces smoke, not tar. You need a specific process. Birch bark buried under coals, heated in an oxygen-poor environment until the resins separate out, or bark rolled into tubes and heated in sealed containers. The tar that emerges is sticky, waterproof, incredibly strong when hardened. But discovering this process required experimentation, chemical understanding that had to be learned through trial and error, and the composite tools enabled new hunting strategies. Spear throwers, also called atlatls, appear in the archaeological record around 30,000 years ago. These are essentially lever extensions for the arm, allowing hunters to throw spears with much greater force and accuracy. A well-thrown atlatl spear could penetrate mammoth hide from 60 feet away. This meant you didn't have to get close to dangerous prey. Could hunt from relative safety. Could bring down animals that would have killed you in close combat. The bow and arrow emerges later, probably around 20,000 years ago based on current evidence, though it might be older and we just haven't found it yet. This represented another revolution in hunting technology. Arrows are smaller and lighter than spears. You can carry dozens of them. You can shoot repeatedly without stopping to retrieve ammunition. And the effective range is even greater than an atlatl. A skilled archer can hit targets at 100 yards or more. This fundamentally changed the dynamics of hunting, making humans even more efficient predators. But perhaps the most underappreciated innovation of this period is the fishhook. Small, easily overlooked in the archaeological record, but representing a profound shift in how humans obtained food. Fishing doesn't require the same physical prowess as hunting megafauna. Children can fish. Elderly people can fish. Injured individuals recovering from trauma can fish. This meant more members of the group could contribute to food acquisition, reducing the burden on prime-age hunters and diversifying the diet in ways that improved overall health. The earliest fishhooks date to around 40,000 years ago. Carved from bone or shell, shaped into simple curved forms with sharpened points. Finding them in archaeological sites is always exciting because they're so rare and so significant. They indicate that humans were exploiting marine resources systematically, not just opportunistically. That they understood fish behavior well enough to know what shapes and sizes of hook worked for different species. That they were manufacturing fishing line, probably from plant fibers or animal sinew, strong enough to land fish weighing many pounds. And fishing led to boats, because the best fishing isn't always from shore. The archaeological evidence for Ice Age watercraft is essentially non-existent because wood and plant materials don't survive tens of thousands of years. But we know boats existed because humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. The journey from Southeast Asia to Australia required crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean even when sea levels were at their lowest. You can't swim that. You can't float on logs that far. You need watercraft capable of carrying people, supplies, and surviving ocean swells. What those boats looked like, we can only guess. Probably simple rafts at first, bundled bamboo or logs lashed together, then dugout canoes, single trees hollowed by fire and stone tools, eventually skin boats, frames of wood covered with sewn hides, lightweight and portable. Each of these technologies requires sophisticated understanding of materials, of water dynamics, of navigation, and each had to be developed through experimentation, probably at the cost of lives lost when early attempts failed. But the experimentation continued because the rewards were enormous. Watercraft opened coastlines for exploration, allowed fishing in deeper waters where larger fish lived, enabled travel and trade over distances that would be impossible overland. By 20,000 years ago, humans were navigating between islands in the Mediterranean. By 15,000 years ago, they were probably coasting along the Pacific shores of the Americas. The ocean, which had been a barrier, became a highway. All of these innovations, from needles to boats, emerged under pressure. When your survival depends on solving problems, you innovate or you die. Your ancestors chose innovation. Constantly, relentlessly. They experimented with new materials, new techniques, new ways of doing things. Most experiments probably failed. But the successes accumulated, each one building on previous knowledge, each one expanding the range of what was possible. And this process was cumulative in ways that earlier human evolution wasn't. Homo erectus used roughly the same stone tool technology for over 1 million years. Very little innovation, very little change. But behaviorally modern humans, they were inventing constantly. New tool types appearing every few thousand years, new techniques spreading across continents, new technologies enabling new lifestyles. The rate of innovation during the period from 100,000 to 12,000 years ago was faster than anything that had come before. Not as fast as modern technological change, but faster than the millions of years of relative stasis that characterized earlier human evolution. Why? Probably because of language and culture. Once you can teach complex ideas verbally, once you can accumulate knowledge across generations, the pace of innovation accelerates. Someone discovers birch tar adhesive through accident or experimentation. They teach their children. Those children teach their children and also refine the technique, make it more efficient. Within a few generations, an entire population has mastered a technology that would have been impossible to discover and transmit without language and teaching. And the innovations weren't isolated. They reinforced each other. Better hunting weapons meant more reliable food supply. More food meant larger populations. Larger populations meant more potential innovators. More innovators meant faster technological development. Faster technological development meant better adaptation to local environments. Better adaptation meant population expansion into new territories. And population expansion meant encountering new challenges that drove further innovation. A positive feedback loop that transformed humans from one primate species among many into the dominant large mammal on the planet. The lost 100,000 years wasn't a period of stasis. It was a period of explosive technological and cultural development, happening faster than at any previous point in human evolution. Your ancestors went from making simple stone tools and wearing draped hides to manufacturing needles, creating fitted clothing, building boats, developing compound adhesives, creating long-range weapons. They went from barely surviving in African grasslands to thriving in Arctic tundra, Australian deserts, Southeast Asian rainforests, European Ice Age steppes. Every environment Earth had to offer, they conquered through innovation, and they did it in a time span that's barely a blink in evolutionary terms. Now we need to talk about one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of any species, the global dispersal of humanity. Because by 12,000 years ago, when the Ice Age was ending, humans had reached almost every landmass on Earth, from the southern tip of South America to the Arctic coast of Siberia, from Pacific islands to European peninsulas. The only major land area we hadn't colonized was Antarctica, and that's only because it was buried under miles of ice. This expansion happened in less than 100,000 years, and for most of it, we have almost no direct evidence of how it occurred. The journey begins in Africa. By 100,000 years ago, modern humans had evolved and were living across much of the continent. Then, sometime between 80,000 and 60,000 years ago, small groups began leaving. Not a mass migration, nothing so organized. Just bands of hunter-gatherers following game, exploring new territories, pushing gradually outward from the African heartland into the Middle East and beyond. The traditional story says this happened in a single wave around 60,000 years ago, that all non-African humans today are descended from one small population that left through the Sinai Peninsula or across the southern Red Sea into Arabia. The genetic evidence seemed to support this. All non-African populations show patterns of relatedness suggesting a common recent ancestor, a bottleneck that reduced diversity right around the time of the proposed migration. But the story is getting more complicated. Recent discoveries suggest there were multiple earlier attempts to leave Africa. Stone tools and fossil remains in Israel dated to over 100,000 years ago that might represent early modern human populations. Evidence from Arabia of human presence during brief wet periods when the desert bloomed into savanna. Genetic traces of archaic admixture suggesting that some early migrants interbred with Neanderthals or other hominins before those lineages disappeared from the DNA of later populations. What seems to have happened is this. Small groups left Africa periodically whenever climate conditions permitted. During wet phases, when the Sahara was less forbidding, when Arabia had rivers and grasslands, humans could migrate north and east. But then conditions would dry again. The populations would contract, many lineages dying out, only to be replaced by new migrants when the next wet phase arrived. This pattern repeated for tens of thousands of years until finally, around 60,000 years ago, one migration succeeded in establishing permanent populations outside Africa. And those populations, armed with the full suite of behavioral modernity, language and technology and social complexity, they never looked back. The journey to Australia is the most impressive part of this dispersal, because reaching Australia required ocean crossings that shouldn't have been possible for Stone Age people. Even with sea levels 300 feet lower than today, even with land bridges connecting most of Southeast Asia into the single landmass of Sunderland, you still had to cross open water. The strait between Sunderland and Australia varied in width, depending on the exact time period, but it was never less than about 60 miles. 60 miles of open ocean with currents and swells and no landmarks visible from either shore. Yet humans made this crossing by at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The archaeological sites in northern Australia at places like Medjedbeb contain stone tools and ochre dated to 65,000 years before present. This means people were building watercraft, navigating out of sight of land, successfully transporting entire families and their possessions across open ocean more than 60,000 years ago. Let that sink in. 60,000 years ago, when Neanderthals were still living in Europe, when most of Africa had barely been explored by modern humans, someone was building boats capable of ocean crossings and using them to reach Australia. What kind of boats? We don't know. No watercraft from this period has survived, but they had to be substantial, capable of carrying multiple people, children included, capable of surviving ocean swells and unpredictable weather. Probably bamboo rafts at minimum, possibly dugout canoes if suitable trees were available. Each crossing would have been terrifying, setting out from known land into empty ocean, hoping you'd reach something on the other side, knowing that if you didn't, you'd die of thirst or exposure or simply disappear into the sea. Some crossings probably failed. How many boats left and never arrived? How many families drowned in storms or were swept off course into the open Pacific where they perished without ever seeing land again? We'll never know. We only see the successes, the ones who made it and established populations that survived. But the failures were real. Each successful colonization of Australia probably came at the cost of multiple failed attempts. And once in Australia, humans faced an entirely new world, Megafauna unlike anything in Africa or Asia. Giant kangaroos standing 10 feet tall, marsupial lions with bolt cutters for jaws, massive monitor lizards, some species possibly venomous, that could weigh hundreds of pounds. Enormous flightless birds, some taller than humans, and the Diprotodon, a 3-ton wombat-like creature that was the largest marsupial ever to exist. All of these animals had evolved without human predation. They had no fear of people, no instinctive wariness. This made them vulnerable, but also dangerous. They didn't run from humans, which meant hunting them required different strategies than hunting African or Asian game that had learned to avoid human hunters. The Australian environment itself was challenging. Much of the continent was arid. Water was scarce and widely scattered. The plant species were unfamiliar, many of them toxic to humans who didn't know how to process them. The seasons were reversed from the northern hemisphere, rainfall patterns were different, and the landscape could kill you if you didn't understand it. Yet humans adapted. Within a few thousand years, they'd spread across the entire continent, developing intricate knowledge of local ecologies, creating trade networks that spanned thousands of miles, establishing religious and cultural traditions that would persist for over 60,000 years. Meanwhile, other populations were pushing into Europe and Asia. By 45,000 years ago, modern humans had reached Europe, where they encountered Neanderthals who'd been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. This meeting between species is one of the great dramas of human prehistory. For thousands of years, the two groups coexisted in the same landscapes. They probably traded. They definitely interbred. We know this from genetic evidence showing that most non-African humans carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. But they remain distinct populations with different tools, different burial practices, different ways of adapting to Ice Age Europe. The relationship probably wasn't friendly. Neanderthals were strong, stocky, cold, adapted. They'd survived multiple glacial cycles in Europe. They knew the landscape, the animals, the seasonal patterns. Modern humans were newcomers, slender, less cold, adapted physically, but perhaps more flexible behaviourally. They had better long-range weapons, more sophisticated social networks, possibly better language capabilities. The competition for resources must have been intense during the coldest phases of the Ice Age when usable territory contracted and every group was struggling to survive. Over time, Neanderthals declined. By 40,000 years ago, their populations were fragmenting, retreating to refugia in southern Europe. By 30,000 years ago, they were gone entirely. The last Neanderthals probably lived in Gibraltar and southern Iberia, hanging on in isolated pockets while modern humans occupied the rest of Europe. Then they vanished. Whether modern humans actively displaced them through competition or violence, whether climate change was the primary driver of their extinction, whether they were simply absorbed into modern human populations through interbreeding, these questions remain unresolved. Probably all three factors played roles, but the result was clear. By 30,000 years ago, modern humans were the only human species left in Europe. The penetration into northern Asia and Siberia happened around the same time. By 40,000 years ago, humans were living beyond the Arctic Circle, in landscapes so cold that survival required perfect clothing, reliable shelter, and sophisticated hunting strategies. These weren't brief summer camps. Archaeological sites show year-round occupation in places where winter temperatures dropped to -50 Fahrenheit, where darkness lasted for months, where a single mistake, a fire going out, a shelter collapsing in the wind, could kill an entire group in hours. Yet humans persisted. They hunted mammoth and reindeer across the frozen steppes. They built substantial shelters, some using mammoth bones as construction material. They developed clothing technology that kept them warm in conditions that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. And they kept pushing east, following the game herds, exploring new territories, eventually reaching the Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia to North America. When humans first crossed into the Americas is one of the most contentious questions in archaeology. The traditional story said around 15,000 years ago, people crossed from Siberia into Alaska, then moved south through an ice-free corridor between glaciers, eventually spreading across both continents. Recent evidence suggests it might have been earlier, possibly by coastal routes that are now underwater. Sites in South America with questionable dates as old as 30,000 years. Footprints in New Mexico that might be 23,000 years old. genetic evidence suggesting population divergence that predates 15,000 years. The truth is probably messy. Multiple waves of migration over thousands of years, some following interior routes when glaciers permitted, others coasting along Pacific shores in boats. Exploiting marine resources, island hopping southward, populations arriving, establishing themselves, sometimes failing and dying out, sometimes being replaced by later arrivals. By 12,000 years ago, humans had definitely reached the southern tip of South America. From the Arctic to Patagonia in less than 3,000 years, possibly much less. This represents one of the fastest colonizations of new territory in the archaeological record. And everywhere they went, they adapted. Tropical rainforests in the Amazon, deserts in the American Southwest, the high-altitude environments of the Andes, coastal regions, interior plains, mountains and valleys. Each environment required different strategies, different tools, different knowledge about local plants and animals, yet humans figured it out, sometimes quickly, within generations. The flexibility that allowed this rapid adaptation, the capacity to learn new skills and develop new technologies and transmit knowledge efficiently, that's what made global dispersal possible. By 12,000 years ago, human populations existed on every continent except Antarctica. They spoke hundreds of different languages. They had developed distinct tool traditions, artistic styles, burial customs, social structures. They'd adapted physically to local conditions, some populations evolving lighter skin in northern latitudes, others developing high-altitude adaptations in mountains, still others adapting to diets rich in marine resources. The biological and cultural diversity of humanity was already established, and all of this incredible variety and adaptability emerged during the lost 100,000 years. The dispersal wasn't planned. Nobody sat down and decided to colonize the planet. It happened through the accumulated decisions of countless small groups, each one pushing just a little further into new territory, exploring the next valley or coastline or river system, finding that they could survive there and staying. Generation after generation, moving gradually outward from Africa until there was nowhere left to go. And in the process, transforming from an African species into a global one, the only large mammal to successfully colonize every terrestrial biome Earth has to offer. But here's the frustrating reality that haunts every archaeologist who studies this period. We're missing most of the story, not because it wasn't recorded, but because the evidence is underwater. During the Ice Age, when glaciers locked up enormous quantities of water, sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than today. This exposed vast areas of continental shelf, and those exposed lands weren't barren seafloor. They were productive territories where humans almost certainly lived. Then the ice melted, the oceans rose, and hundreds of thousands of square miles of human habitation area disappeared beneath the waves. Think about what this means. Your ancestors weren't idiots. They understood that coastlines offered resources that interior regions couldn't match. Shellfish in tidal zones, fish in shallow waters, seabirds nesting on cliffs, marine mammals hauling out on beaches. Coastal areas provided consistent, reliable food sources that didn't migrate seasonally the way terrestrial game did. If you lived on the coast during the Ice Age, you had access to protein-rich seafood year-round. This would have made coastal regions some of the most desirable places to live, and we know humans were exploiting marine resources because we find shell middens at sites that were coastal during the Ice Age. Massive heaps of discarded shells, sometimes meters deep, representing thousands of years of shellfish gathering, fish bones showing evidence of systematic exploitation, tools adapted for marine resource processing. The archaeological signature is clear. Humans were coastal specialists during much of this period, possibly more coastal than we typically imagine. But here's the problem. The coastlines where these people lived are now underwater. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, they rose fast, not uniformly, but in pulses. Meltwater pulses where ice dams would break and enormous quantities of glacial meltwater would flood into the oceans, raising sea levels by meters in just decades. During these pulses, coastlines would retreat inland by miles. Entire landscapes would be inundated, settlements would be abandoned as the sea advanced, and everything left behind would be drowned. Take Doggerland, the region that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. During the Ice Age, this was dry land, a vast low-lying territory of rivers and marshes and rolling hills. Archaeological evidence suggests it was densely populated. Stone tools have been pulled up by fishing trawlers working the North Sea, mammoth bones showing butchery marks, evidence of settlements and seasonal camps. This was productive territory, probably supporting substantial human populations for thousands of years. Then the ice melted. By around 8,000 years ago, Doggerland was mostly submerged. By 6,000 years ago, it was completely underwater. Britain became an island, and all the archaeological sites, all the settlements and camps and hunting grounds that had existed in Doggerland, they're now sitting under 100 feet of seawater and centuries of marine sediment. We can't excavate them, can't study them, can't recover the artifacts that would tell us how people lived there. The evidence exists, but it's effectively out of reach. The same story repeats worldwide. Sunderland, the exposed continental shelf of Southeast Asia, was an area larger than India. During the Ice Age, you could walk from Thailand to Borneo. The region was probably densely forested, cut by major rivers, home to substantial human populations. We know people lived there because humans passed through Sunderland on their way to Australia. But where exactly did they live? What routes did they follow? What technologies did they develop? We don't know because Sunderland is underwater now. The archaeological sites are drowned. The Bering Land Bridge between Siberia and Alaska was hundreds of miles wide during the glacial maximum, a grassy steppe supporting herds of mammoth and bison. Humans must have crossed it, probably multiple times over thousands of years, but the land bridge is submerged now. The archaeological evidence of those crossings, the campsites and kill sites and seasonal settlements, they're on the ocean floor beneath the Bering Strait, inaccessible to traditional archaeology. Even coastlines that still exist have lost their Ice Age predecessors, the current California coast. During the Ice Age, the coastline was miles further west. The continental shelf that's now underwater was dry land where people could have lived. The Atlantic coast of the United States? Same story. The real Ice Age coastline is now underwater. Any settlements that existed there are drowned. We're left studying inland sites and extrapolating from them what coastal life might have been like. But it's guesswork. Educated guesswork based on what we know about coastal resources and human behaviour, but guesswork nonetheless. And it's not just settlements we're missing, it's entire lifestyles. Some researchers think coastal populations during the Ice Age might have been more sophisticated than inland groups. They had reliable food sources. They could support larger populations, they could specialise, some people focusing on fishing while others gathered shellfish or hunted seabirds. This specialisation could have led to more complex social organisations, more elaborate trade networks, possibly even semi-sedentary settlements where people lived year-round rather than moving seasonally. There are hints of this in the few coastal sites that survived. Shell middens that show occupation over thousands of years, bone tools specialised for marine resource processing, evidence of boats and fishing gear, but these are sites that happen to be at elevations high enough to escape flooding when sea levels rose. The majority of Ice Age coastal sites, especially those on productive low-lying coastal plains, they're gone, drowned and buried and lost. The frustration for archaeologists is enormous. They can see that coastal adaptation was important during this period. They can infer from modern hunter-gatherer societies that coastal life probably supported complex cultures, but they can't prove it because the evidence is underwater, and underwater archaeology in deep water is expensive, difficult, and limited in scope. We've explored more of the moon than we have of Ice Age coastal sites now sitting under hundreds of feet of ocean. Some underwater work has been done. Divers have found stone tools and mammoth bones in the North Sea, evidence of Doggerland's lost inhabitants. Researchers using sonar have mapped submerged river valleys and identified potential settlement sites on drowned coastal plains. A few locations have been excavated, revealing artifacts and even structural remains, but these are rare successes. Most of the drowned landscape remains unexplored, most of the archaeological sites remain undiscovered, and it's not just the ocean that swallowed evidence. Lakes expanded and contracted with climate changes. The Great Lakes in North America didn't exist during the glacial maximum. They formed from meltwater as the glaciers retreated. Any human sites in the lake basins were inundated. Same with countless smaller lakes worldwide. Rivers changed course as landscapes warped under the weight of ice and rebounded when it melted. Sites on the former riverbanks were eroded away or buried under new sediments. The Black Sea might hold one of the most dramatic examples of flooding. Some researchers think it was a freshwater lake during the Ice Age, isolated from the Mediterranean. Then, around 7,500 years ago, sea levels rose enough that Mediterranean water breached the Bosporus and flooded into the Black Sea basin. The water level rose rapidly, maybe catastrophically. If people were living around the shores of what had been a freshwater lake, they would have seen the ocean advancing, swallowing their settlements, forcing them to flee inland. Some researchers speculate this might be the origin of flood myths that appear in cultures around the region. Maybe. We can't prove it because the evidence is underwater. Even without catastrophic flooding, gradual sea level rise would have been devastating for coastal populations. Imagine living in a coastal settlement. Your group has occupied this location for generations. You know every reef and tidal pool. You've built shelters, established caches, created a home. Then over the course of your lifetime, the sea begins advancing, slowly at first, just a few inches per year, but it doesn't stop. The beach you knew as a child is underwater by the time you're an elder. The tidal zone has shifted hundreds of yards inland. Eventually the settlement itself is threatened. You have to move or drown. This happened to coastal populations worldwide as the Ice Age ended. Between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the glaciers melted, sea levels rose by over 300 feet. That's an average of about 1 foot every 25 years. Slow enough that individual humans might not notice the change from year to year. Fast enough that over a generation the landscape would be transformed. Coastlines that grandparents remembered would be gone. Settlements would have to relocate repeatedly, always moving inland, always losing their coastal positions. And each time they moved, they left behind the physical evidence of their lives, the shell middens accumulated over centuries, the stone tools cached for future use, the hearths where fires had burned for generations, all of it drowned, all of it lost to rising seas. We know it existed because humans don't just abandon productive territories without reason, but we can't study it because it's underwater now. This is why the archaeological record from the period between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago is so patchy in many coastal regions, not because humans weren't there, but because the places where they were living are now beneath the ocean. We're seeing only the inland sites, the temporary camps and seasonal hunting grounds. The main settlements, the places where people spent most of their time, where complex social organizations would have been most evident, those are underwater. Some researchers estimate that we've lost up to 90% of Ice Age coastal archaeological sites to sea level rise. 90%. If that's even close to accurate, then our understanding of how humans lived during this period is based on 10% of the evidence. We're reconstructing Ice Age life from the margins, from the least representative sites, from the places people went when they left the coast. It's like trying to understand modern civilization by only studying highway rest stops. You'd miss cities, suburbs, industrial centres, everything that makes modern life what it is. The drowned landscapes hold secrets we'll probably never recover. Settlements that might have supported hundreds of people, trade networks that connected coastal populations across thousands of miles, technologies adapted for marine resource exploitation that we can only guess at based on surviving fragments, artistic traditions, social organizations, religious practices, all potentially lost beneath the waves. The ocean is the great archive of human prehistory. And it's mostly unread. This is one of the cruelest ironies of studying Ice Age humans. The very environmental changes that shaped their evolution, the glacial cycles and sea level fluctuations, those same changes destroyed most of the evidence of their existence. The ice that forced them to adapt crushed sites beneath its weight. The meltwater that signalled the Ice Age's end drowned their coastal settlements. We're left trying to understand a period defined by its interaction with changing coastlines, when those coastlines themselves are gone. It's like being handed a book where every page referencing the ocean has been torn out, then being asked to summarise the plot. You can try, but you know you're missing the most important parts of the story. So here's the question that should bother you. If your ancestors were so smart, so innovative, so capable of adapting to any environment Earth threw at them, why did it take them so long to invent agriculture and build cities? Anatomically, modern humans emerged 300,000 years ago. Behaviourally, modern humans were around by at least 70,000 years ago. Yet civilization, defined as permanent settlements, agriculture, writing, complex hierarchies that didn't appear until around 12,000 years ago at the earliest. What were humans doing for those hundreds of thousands of years? Why the long wait? The traditional answer is that agriculture hadn't been invented yet, that humans were stuck in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle because they hadn't figured out that you could plant seeds and harvest crops and domesticate animals. Once they made that cognitive leap, boom, civilization followed. Except this explanation doesn't really work, because humans weren't stupid. They understood plant reproduction. They'd been gathering plant foods for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew that seeds grew into plants. They knew which plants were edible and which weren't. They knew the seasonal cycles of plant growth. The knowledge required for agriculture was there. They just weren't using it. So why not? What kept Ice Age humans from becoming farmers? The answer isn't cognitive. It's environmental and cultural. Agriculture only makes sense under specific conditions, and for most of the past 100,000 years those conditions didn't exist. Start with climate stability. Agriculture requires predictable seasons. You plant in spring, you harvest in autumn. This works if spring reliably comes at roughly the same time each year, if growing seasons are consistent, if rainfall patterns are stable. But during the Ice Age, climate was anything but stable. The period from 100,000 to 12,000 years ago was characterized by wild climate swings. Temperatures would plummet, then warm, then plummet again. Rainfall patterns would shift dramatically over the course of a human lifetime. Growing seasons would expand and contract. In these conditions, agriculture is a terrible survival strategy. You invest enormous labor in clearing land, planting crops, tending fields. Then, an unexpected cold snap kills everything. Or a drought, or flooding. You've wasted months of effort and you're worse off than if you'd just kept hunting and gathering. Hunter-gatherers, by contrast, are flexible. If one resource fails, they shift to another. If the reindeer migration route changes, they follow it. If a particular plant doesn't produce this year, they eat something else. They're not tied to fields that might fail. They're mobile, adaptable, capable of responding to environmental changes quickly. In unstable climates, this flexibility is a survival advantage. Agriculture, with its reliance on predictable conditions, becomes a liability. This is why agriculture emerged when it did. Around 15,000 years ago, the Ice Age began ending. Not immediately, not smoothly, but in fits and starts. Temperatures warmed, glaciers retreated, and critically, climate began stabilizing. The wild swings that had characterized the Ice Age started settling into more predictable patterns. Seasons became regular. Growing seasons extended and became reliable. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, conditions favored agriculture. But even stable climate wasn't enough. You also need the right plants and animals. Not everything can be domesticated. Most wild plants produce seeds too small, or too toxic, or too dispersed to be worth cultivating. Most wild animals are too aggressive or too large or too slow breeding to domesticate. You need species that happen to have the right characteristics. Large seeds, mild temperaments, fast generation times. These species are rare, and they're not evenly distributed across the world. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East had a unique concentration of domesticable species. Wild wheat and barley with large seeds. Wild sheep and goats that could be tamed. Wild cattle that, while dangerous, could eventually be controlled. Pigs that reproduced quickly. All of these species existed in close proximity, allowing early farmers to develop agriculture and animal husbandry simultaneously. This combination, the right plants and animals in the same region with newly stable climate, created conditions where agriculture became advantageous. Elsewhere, the species weren't available. Australia had no domesticable grains, no large mammals suitable for domestication. Southern Africa had different plants that required different processing. The Americas had some domesticable species, but they were scattered. Maize in Mesoamerica, potatoes in the Andes, but no large domesticable mammals except llamas. This meant agriculture developed later and differently in these regions, not because people were less intelligent, because they had different raw materials to work with. But there's another factor that's often overlooked. Agriculture is hard work, much harder than hunting and gathering. Modern studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies show they work about 15 to 20 hours per week obtaining food. The rest of their time is leisure, socializing, rest. Early farmers, by contrast to Bousam, worked constantly, clearing land, planting, weeding, harvesting, processing grain, storing it, protecting it from pests and thieves. Agriculture meant longer work hours, less leisure, more physical labor, and for what? Early agricultural diets were actually less nutritious than hunter-gatherer diets. More carbohydrates, less protein, and fat. Skeletal evidence shows early farmers were shorter, less healthy, suffered more diseases than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. So why switch? Because agriculture had one overwhelming advantage. It could support larger populations. A plot of farmland could feed more people per square mile than hunting and gathering could. This meant agricultural populations could grow denser. They could support more children. They could expand faster than hunter-gatherer populations. In competition for territory, farmers had numbers on their side. Even if individual farmers were less healthy, the population as a whole could outcompete hunter-gatherers through sheer demographic pressure. But this advantage only appeared once agriculture was established. Getting to that point required a threshold. You needed enough people in a small enough area with stable enough climate and suitable plants and animals, all coming together at the same time. For most of the Ice Age, these conditions never aligned. Populations were too small and dispersed. Climate was too unstable. The necessary species weren't in the right places, so humans stayed hunter-gatherers. Not because they couldn't imagine agriculture, but because it didn't make sense given the circumstances they faced. There's even evidence that humans were moving toward agriculture slowly before the Neolithic Revolution. Sites from 15,000 years ago show increased use of wild grains, grinding stones for processing seeds, storage pits suggesting people were keeping harvests for later use, semi-permanent settlements in areas with particularly rich resources. These aren't full agriculture, but they're steps in that direction. Humans were experimenting, trying different strategies, seeing what worked, and in regions where conditions were right, those experiments eventually succeeded. The site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is fascinating for this reason. Built around 11,600 years ago, it features massive stone pillars arranged in circular structures, carved with elaborate animal reliefs. This required coordinated labor by hundreds of people. It required a social organization complex enough to motivate and feed workers over years of construction, and it was built by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture yet. The conventional chronology says agriculture came first, then complex societies, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reverses this. Complex society and monumental architecture came first, agriculture followed. This suggests the transition to agriculture wasn't a simple invention that triggered civilization. It was a complex process where multiple developments, social organization, sedentism, ritual practices, plant cultivation, all evolved together, each one reinforcing the others. In some regions, people might have been gathering in large seasonal groups for ritual purposes. These gatherings would have depleted local wild resources. This depletion created pressure to supplement wild foods with cultivated plants. The cultivation supported larger gatherings. Larger gatherings depleted resources more, a positive feedback loop that gradually shifted populations from hunting and gathering to agriculture. The Ice Age humans weren't waiting for agriculture. They were living successful lives as hunter-gatherers. They had sophisticated technologies, rich cultures, complex social organizations. They created art and music and stories. They cared for their children and elderly. They formed bonds that transcended immediate self-interest. They were fully human in every sense. Agriculture wasn't an improvement on this lifestyle. It was a different adaptation to different circumstances. And when circumstances changed, when climate stabilized and populations grew and the right species were available, humans adapted again. That's what they'd been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. Adapting. The lost 100,000 years weren't a waiting period before real history began. They were the foundation. Everything that makes us human, language, art, music, social complexity, technological innovation, symbolic thought. All of it emerged during this period. Your ancestors during these millennia were the ones who figured out how to survive in every environment Earth offered, who developed the cognitive and cultural tools that would later make civilization possible, who created the social structures and knowledge transmission systems that would allow rapid adaptation to new challenges. When agriculture did emerge and civilization followed, it wasn't because humans suddenly got smarter or more capable. It was because they finally faced circumstances where their existing capabilities could be applied in new ways. The intelligence that had been used for tracking game across frozen steppes could be used for managing crop rotations. The social organization that coordinated mammoth hunts could coordinate irrigation projects. The symbolic thinking that created cave art could create writing systems. The knowledge transmission that taught children to knap stone could teach them to forge bronze. Civilization didn't replace Ice Age life, it built on it. Every major development of the last 12,000 years, from cities to agriculture to writing to metallurgy to everything that followed, all of it depended on capabilities that evolved during the lost 100,000 years. We are not more advanced than our Ice Age ancestors. We've simply had different opportunities to apply the same fundamental human capacities that they developed. And if you think about it, they faced harder challenges with fewer resources. They survived climate swings that would destroy modern civilization. They adapted to environments from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, with nothing but stone tools and fire and their own ingenuity. They maintained cultures and transmitted knowledge across thousands of generations without writing. They created beauty in the darkest caves and the harshest conditions. They loved and mourned and wondered about the same things we wonder about. They were us, separated only by time. So when you think about prehistory, don't imagine crude primitives stumbling towards civilization. Imagine people every bit as intelligent as you, facing challenges you can barely imagine, solving problems with creativity and cooperation and sheer determination. Imagine 100,000 years of human triumph, of survival against impossible odds, of cultural development and technological innovation and social evolution. Imagine the lives lived, the children raised, the stories told, the art created, the bonds formed, all of it happening in a world we've lost but which made our world possible. The lost 100,000 years weren't lost, they're just hidden, scattered across archaeological sites we haven't found yet, drowned beneath rising oceans, eroded away by time, but they happened. Every moment of those 100,000 years mattered. Every innovation, every adaptation, every individual who survived long enough to pass their knowledge to the next generation, they all contributed to the species we became. We're here because they were there. We can build cities because they learned to build shelters. We can write because they learned to speak. We can imagine futures because they learned to plan. We are their legacy, and theirs is a story worth remembering, even in fragments, even in the dark, even as we drift off to sleep thinking about the deep time that made us human. The archaeological sites we do have from this period paint a picture that's simultaneously fascinating and frustratingly incomplete. We know humans were creating art because we find pigments and engraved patterns on bone and stone. We know they were developing increasingly sophisticated tools because we can track the evolution of stoneworking techniques across millennia. We know they were forming complex social groups because we find evidence of long-distance trade in materials like obsidian and marine shells transported hundreds of miles from their sources. We know they cared for their sick and elderly because we find skeletons showing healed injuries that would have been fatal without extended care. But for every piece of evidence we have, there are 1,000 questions we can't answer. When exactly did humans develop full grammatical language as opposed to simple communication? We don't know precisely. The anatomical capability was there by 600,000 years ago, but complex language probably emerged much more recently. How did they organize their societies? What were their family structures, their systems of authority, their methods of resolving disputes? We can make educated guesses based on modern hunter-gatherer societies, but those are separated from Ice Age peoples by tens of thousands of years of cultural evolution. What did they believe about death, about the world around them, about their place in the cosmos? The burial practices and cave art suggest they had rich spiritual lives, but the details are lost. And then there are the gaps we know exist but can't even begin to fill. How many human species walked the Earth during this period besides Homo sapiens? We know about Neanderthals and Denisovans, but genetic evidence suggests there were others, populations that interbred with modern humans and left traces in our DNA but which have vanished from the fossil record entirely. ghost populations that existed for hundreds of thousands of years, that had their own cultures and technologies and stories, and which we'll probably never find physical evidence of because the conditions for fossilization are so vanishingly rare. The technology we do find tells us these people were innovating constantly, but at a pace so slow compared to modern change that it's easy to miss how revolutionary it actually was. The development from simple stone flakes to sophisticated composite tools with multiple components took tens of thousands of years. But it happened, bit by bit, generation after generation, each one adding something small to the accumulated knowledge, building on what came before. By the end of this period, humans had invented needle and thread, tailored clothing, long-range weapons, watercraft capable of ocean crossings, methods for preserving food, techniques for rendering useless stone into usable adhesives through careful application of heat. Each of these inventions required leaps of imagination and patient experimentation that we can barely appreciate. Consider the invention of the needle. Someone had to imagine joining pieces of hide with stitches instead of just tying them together. Then they had to figure out how to create a tool that could make those stitches. Selecting bone or ivory with the right properties, shaping it without breaking it, drilling a hole through one end, a task that requires precision and patience when working with Stone Age tools. How many attempts failed? How many hours were invested in developing this single technology? We'll never know. But the result changed human history, enabling fitted clothing that made survival possible in the coldest environments on Earth. Or think about fire making. Controlling fire that you've captured from lightning strikes or wildfires is one thing. Creating fire on demand from nothing but wood and friction is something else entirely. It requires understanding that friction creates heat, that certain combinations of wood work better than others, that you need tinder dry enough to catch from a tiny ember, that you need to blow gently to encourage the flame without extinguishing it. Someone had to figure all this out through trial and error, probably over generations, and once they did, they had to teach it reliably enough that the knowledge didn't die with them. The social structures required to transmit this kind of technical knowledge across generations. The patience to teach and learn complex multi-step processes, these are uniquely human capacities that had to evolve during this period. The cave art that appears around 40,000 years ago represents another quantum leap in human capability. Not just the ability to create images, but the conceptual framework required to understand that a two-dimensional representation could stand for a three-dimensional reality. That marks on a wall could represent an animal, a hunt, a story, a spiritual belief. This level of symbolic abstraction is foundational to everything that makes us human. Language itself is symbolic abstraction. Writing is symbolic abstraction. Mathematics, music, religion, law, all of it depends on the ability to let one thing stand for another thing. To manipulate symbols in your mind and understand that others will interpret those symbols the same way you do. And here's what makes the cave art so remarkable. It wasn't created by a few gifted individuals. It was a cultural tradition that lasted for over 20,000 years. 20,000 years. Think about that. The cave painters of Chauvet in France, working 35,000 years ago, were as distant in time from the cave painters of Altamira in Spain 15,000 years ago as Altamira is from us. Yet both were working in recognizably similar artistic traditions. Both were painting the same animals with similar techniques. Both were venturing deep into caves to create images in permanent locations. This represents cultural continuity over time spans that dwarf all of recorded history. What knowledge was being transmitted to allow this continuity? How did artists 35,000 years ago teach their students in ways that ensured the tradition would persist for another 20 millennia? What social structures supported artists who were presumably spending significant time creating images instead of hunting or gathering? What beliefs or needs drove people to keep creating cave art generation after generation, for longer than agriculture has existed? The art itself survives. The cultural context that created it is mostly lost. And this brings us back to the fundamental mystery. We're looking at 100,000 years of human development through a keyhole, seeing fragments, catching glimpses, missing the crucial connections. The people who lived during this period had full, rich lives. They laughed and cried. They fell in love and grieved their losses. They told stories around fires and taught their children and wondered about the stars. They experienced joy and suffering and boredom and excitement. They were people, fully human, living complete lives. But most of those lives left no trace. Most of that 100,000 years is simply gone. The climate chaos of this period adds another layer of complexity to an already difficult puzzle. Your ancestors weren't living in the stable, predictable environments where they could develop and refine strategies over long periods. They were dealing with wild temperature swings, dramatic shifts in rainfall, landscapes that transformed within a few generations. Forests would give way to grasslands, rivers would dry up or change course. The animals they'd been hunting for generations would migrate to new territories or go extinct entirely. And through all of this environmental chaos, humans had to adapt or die. Most species respond to climate change through biological evolution. Populations in colder regions evolve thicker fur, different metabolisms, behavioral adaptations that take thousands or millions of years to manifest. But humans during this period were adapting culturally, technologically, socially. When the climate cooled, they didn't wait for evolution to give them thicker hair. They invented better clothing. When game animals migrated, they didn't slowly evolve to digest new food sources. They developed new hunting strategies, new tools, new ways of preserving and processing food. This cultural adaptation was far faster than biological evolution could ever be. And it's what allowed humans to survive and spread during a period when many other large mammal species were going extinct. The megafauna extinctions that happened during the late Pleistocene are still poorly understood. We know that many large animal species disappeared between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, dire wolves, glyptodonts, cave lions, woolly rhinos, and dozens of other species all went extinct. Some scientists blame climate change. Others point to human hunting pressure. The truth is probably some combination of both. But what's clear is that humans survived this period of massive environmental disruption, while many other large mammals didn't. Part of the reason is that humans weren't specialized. Neanderthals were cold-adapted, stocky, with large nasal cavities for warming frigid air, bodies built for life in Ice Age Europe. When conditions changed, when the climate warmed and their preferred environments disappeared, they struggled to adapt and eventually went extinct. But modern humans were generalists. They could survive in the cold and the heat. They could eat almost anything, hunt any animal, live in any environment. This flexibility, this lack of specialization, turned out to be humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage. And flexibility required intelligence, not just the ability to solve problems, but the capacity to imagine solutions that didn't yet exist, to see a piece of bone and imagine it as a needle, to see a stone and imagine the sharp tool hidden inside it waiting to be revealed through careful flaking, to see a landscape and imagine the route your prey will take when you drive them toward a cliff. This kind of imaginative projection, the ability to see potential in raw materials and plan multiple steps ahead, this is what made human technology possible. And it had to evolve during this period because the archaeological record shows it wasn't present in earlier human species. Homo erectus used essentially the same hand axe design for over 1 million years. 1 million years of technological stasis. But behaviorally modern humans, they were innovating constantly. New tool types appearing every few thousand years, new technologies spreading across continents, new adaptations emerging wherever humans encountered new environments. The rate of change was glacially slow by modern standards, but revolutionary compared to what came before. Something had changed in how humans thought, in how they approached problems, in how they transmitted knowledge across generations. Language was probably the key, not just the ability to make sounds and assign them meanings, but full recursive syntactic language, with grammar and embedded clauses and the capacity to talk about things that aren't physically present. This level of linguistic complexity allows for much more efficient transmission of knowledge. You can't teach someone to make a composite tool with adhesive just by demonstrating. There are too many steps, too many decisions based on properties you can't see. You need to be able to say heat the resin until it becomes liquid but not so much that it burns, and have the learner understand the abstract concepts of heat and liquidity and combustion and how they relate to each other. Language makes this possible, but language also requires something else. Social structures stable enough and large enough to maintain linguistic complexity across generations. Small, isolated groups can lose linguistic features if they're not used regularly. Complex grammatical structures can simplify when there aren't enough speakers to maintain them. So the emergence of complex language probably went hand in hand with the development of larger, more interconnected social networks, groups that interacted regularly enough to maintain shared linguistic conventions. Populations large enough that children learned language from multiple adults, reinforcing grammatical structures through repeated exposure. The genetic evidence suggests human populations went through several bottlenecks during this period, times when the total number of humans alive might have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals or even fewer. These population crashes would have been catastrophic for cultural transmission. Knowledge that wasn't widely shared could be lost entirely. Specialized skills practiced by only a few individuals might disappear when those individuals died. Each bottleneck was a near-extinction event that could have ended the human story before it really began. Yet humans survived. They rebuilt populations after each crash. They recovered lost knowledge or invented new knowledge to replace what was lost. They adapted to the new conditions that caused the population collapse in the first place, and they emerged from each bottleneck perhaps slightly different, carrying new genetic variants that had been selected for during the crisis, developing new cultural practices that helped them survive similar future challenges. This is the real story of the lost 100,000 years, not a simple narrative of progress from primitive to advanced, but a complex, messy, often tragic story of survival against overwhelming odds, of populations expanding and contracting with climate cycles, of cultures developing and sometimes disappearing entirely, of innovation spreading and knowledge being lost and being rediscovered, of humans fighting daily to survive while also finding time and energy to create beauty, to form bonds, to wonder about the universe and their place in it. Every person alive today is descended from the survivors, from the people who made it through the bottlenecks, who adapted when adaptation was possible, and endured when adaptation wasn't enough, who maintained their cultures through catastrophic climate shifts, who kept their children alive through famines and cold snaps and predator attacks, who passed on their knowledge even when times were so hard that simply staying alive consumed all their energy. We exist because they refused to give up, and their legacy is more than just our DNA. It's the capacity for language that lets you understand these words, the social instincts that make you form bonds with friends and family, the technological aptitude that lets you master complex tools, the artistic impulse that makes you respond to beauty, the curiosity that makes you wonder about the past and the future. All of this, every aspect of human nature that we value, was forged during those 100,000 years, tested in the crucible of Ice Age survival, refined through countless generations of selection pressure, passed down to us as an inheritance we barely recognize as such. So when you think about prehistory, remember that it's not really pre-anything. It's not preparation for history or a prologue to the real story. It is the story, the 100,000 years that made us human. The period when everything distinctive about our species evolved. The time when our ancestors figured out how to survive anything, anywhere, under any conditions. When they went from being one primate among many to the most successful large mammal the planet has ever seen. And if that helps you drift off to sleep tonight, thinking about deep time and lost worlds and ancestors who face challenges we can barely imagine, then that's good. Because they're worth dreaming about. They're worth remembering, they're worth honouring, even if we can only see them through the gaps in the fossil record, even if most of their lives are lost to us forever. They were here, they mattered, they made us possible. And that's a story worth telling, even in fragments, even in whispers, even as we fall asleep thinking about the 100,000 years that science can barely document, but which shaped everything about what it means to be human. The archaeological sites that have been excavated tell us so much and yet so little. A hearth with charcoal dating to 60,000 years ago tells us humans controlled fire at that time and location. But it doesn't tell us who gathered around that fire, what stories they told, what songs they sang, what fears kept them awake and what hopes gave them reason to continue. A stone tool found in a riverbed tells us someone napped it, but not who they were, what they were thinking as they worked, whether they were young or old, experienced or learning, alone or surrounded by family. Each artifact is a message across time, but the message is fragmentary. We're receiving transmissions from 100,000 years away, and most of the signal is lost to noise. What comes through are the barest outlines. They were here. They made this. They moved from this place to that place. They ate these animals and gathered these plants, but the texture of their lives, the emotional content, the meaning they made from their experiences, that's mostly silent. We can guess. We can extrapolate from what we know about modern humans and modern hunter-gatherers, but we're guessing. The truth is buried in gaps we'll probably never fill, and yet, what fragments we have are precious. Every shell bead is evidence of aesthetic sense, of the impulse to beautify the self. Every careful burial suggests love and loss and hope for something beyond death. Every cave painting is proof that humans 40,000 years ago saw the same beauty in moving animals that we see today. They responded to it, created representations of it, valued it enough to invest enormous labor in making it permanent. These fragments tell us that our ancestors were fully human in every sense that matters. They felt what we feel. They wondered what we wonder. They faced the ultimate questions about existence and meaning and death, and tried to answer them through symbol and ritual and art. They weren't waiting to become us. They already were us, just living in different circumstances with different challenges, different opportunities, but human. Completely, recognizably, undeniably human.